++cent. Ukraine today. Following the Euromaidan revolution and subsequent conflict in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine embarked on a complex path of reform and national renewal under President Petro Poroshenko, 2014-2019. Despite the ongoing war, which consumed approximately 5% of GDP in defense spending, the Poroshenko administration implemented significant reforms across multiple sectors. These included the creation of new anti-corruption institutions like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, comprehensive banking sector reform, healthcare system restructuring, and decentralization that empowered local communities. The implementation of the EU Association Agreement's deep and comprehensive free trade area provisions reoriented Ukraine's economic ties westward, with the EU replacing Russia as Ukraine's largest trading partner by 2016. These reforms, while substantial, remained incomplete and often faced resistance from entrenched interests. Anti-corruption efforts particularly struggled, with newly created institutions frequently finding themselves in bureaucratic conflicts with established power centers like the Prosecutor General's office. Public frustration with the pace of change and perceptions of continued corruption contributed to Poroshenko's electoral defeat in 2019. The 2019 presidential and parliamentary elections brought political newcomer Volodymyr Zelensky to power with an overwhelming mandate. A former comedian and actor with no previous political experience, Zelensky won 73% of the vote in the presidential runoff against Poroshenko, followed by his newly created Servant of the People Party securing a parliamentary majority, the first single-party majority in independent Ukraine's history. This unprecedented concentration of political power created expectations for accelerated reforms and progress on resolving the Donbass conflict. Zelensky's administration initially focused on peace efforts and continued reforms. Early prisoner exchanges with Russia in September 2019 returned prominent Ukrainian prisoners, including filmmaker Oleg Sentsov and 24 sailors captured during the 2018 Kerch Strait incident. By December 2019, Zelensky had met with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Normandy Format Summit in Paris, resulting in further prisoner exchanges and renewed commitments to the Minsk process. However, fundamental disagreements on the sequencing of political and security provisions prevented substantial progress. On the domestic front, the government continued land reform, ending a 2-decade moratorium on agricultural land sales, banking sector reforms, and digitalization of government services through the innovative DIA application. However, by 2021, Zelensky's administration faced declining popularity amid the COVID-19 pandemic, economic challenges, and perceived backsliding on anti-corruption efforts. The October 2021 Pandora Papers revelations, which showed Zelensky and associates maintained offshore companies, further damaged his reform credentials, though he maintained higher approval ratings than other prominent politicians. Russia's path to full-scale invasion. Understanding Russia's February 2022 invasion requires examining multiple factors, including the Kremlin's evolving view of Ukraine, NATO's eastward expansion, and domestic Russian political dynamics. From Moscow's perspective, Ukraine's post-2014 westward trajectory represented both a geopolitical setback and an ideological threat. Putin repeatedly articulated a view that Russians and Ukrainians constitute one people, with Ukraine's separate identity portrayed as an artificial construct resulting from historical accidents and foreign interference. This ethnonationalist framework provided ideological justification for denying Ukrainian sovereignty. NATO's post-Cold War expansion into Eastern Europe remained a fundamental Russian grievance. While NATO consistently maintained its open-door policy was not anti-Russian, the Kremlin viewed the alliance's growth as a strategic encirclement that violated alleged verbal assurances given during German reunification negotiations. Although Ukraine was not offered a formal membership action plan, the alliance's 2008 Bucharest declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO remained a particular source of Russian opposition. This position hardened after the 2014 Euromaidan, which Moscow characterized as a Western-backed coup aimed at pulling Ukraine into the Western orbit. The immediate prelude to invasion began in April-May 2021, when Russia conducted a massive military buildup near Ukraine's borders, claiming these were normal exercises. While forces partially withdrew after a Biden-Putin summit in June, a second, larger buildup commenced in October-November 2021. By December 2021, U.S. intelligence assessed that Russia was planning a multi-front invasion and began sharing this intelligence with allies and publicly warning of the threat. On December 17, 2021, Russia issued demands for security guarantees, including NATO's permanent exclusion of Ukraine from membership, removal of NATO infrastructure from Eastern European members who joined after 1997, and limitations on military deployments in Europe. Throughout January and early February 2022, intensive diplomatic efforts attempted to avert conflict. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and others met with Putin, while the U.S. and NATO provided written responses to Russian security demands. These responses rejected core Russian demands regarding NATO's open-door policy, but offered discussions on arms control, transparency measures, and risk reduction. Meanwhile, Russia continued amassing forces, eventually positioning approximately 190,000 troops around Ukraine's borders. Putin's decision-making calculus likely included several miscalculations: an underestimation of Ukrainian resistance, an overestimation of Russian military capabilities, expectations of Western disunity, and a belief that the Ukrainian government would collapse quickly. Domestic factors may have played a role as well, with the invasion potentially serving to distract from economic stagnation and consolidate nationalist support around Putin's leadership. Whatever the precise mixture of motivations, Putin authorized what Russia euphemistically termed a special military operation to begin on February 24, 2022. The invasion and initial international response. The Russian invasion commenced with cruise missile strikes against military airfields, command centers, and infrastructure across Ukraine, followed by ground forces advancing along multiple axes from Russia, Belarus, and Crimea. Initial Russian objectives appeared to include the rapid capture of Kiev and overthrow of the Ukrainian government, control of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, and the securing of a land bridge to Crimea through southeastern Ukraine. Against widespread expectations, Ukraine's defense proved remarkably effective. President Zelensky's decision to remain in Kiev, famously responding to evacuation offers with "I need ammunition, not a ride," galvanized Ukrainian resistance. The Russian offensive toward Kiev stalled amid logistical problems, poor coordination, and determined Ukrainian defense utilizing Western-supplied anti-tank weapons like javelins and NLAWs. After suffering heavy losses, Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine by early April 2022, recalibrating their war aims to focus on the Donbass region and southern Ukraine. The international response surpassed most predictions in both speed and scope. Within days of the invasion, the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, and other partners imposed unprecedented sanctions targeting Russia's central bank reserves, major banks, key industries, and regime-connected individuals. Russia's approximately $300 billion in foreign reserves held in Western institutions were frozen, while technological export controls restricted access to semiconductors and other critical components. Major corporations, from McDonald's to Shell, announced withdrawals from the Russian market, representing the most significant corporate exodus from a major economy in recent history. Military support for Ukraine rapidly expanded beyond pre-invasion expectations. The United States authorized an initial $350 million in emergency military assistance within days. The summer 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, long anticipated and preceded by extensive training and equipment deliveries from Western partners, achieved more limited territorial gains than hoped. Extensive Russian defensive preparations, including vast minefields, anti-tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, and layered defensive positions, significantly slowed Ukrainian advances in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk oblasts. However, Ukrainian forces achieved notable successes in the Black Sea, effectively neutralizing Russia's Black Sea fleet through innovative use of maritime drones and Neptune anti-ship missiles, enabling the partial restoration of grain exports. By late 2023 and early 2024, Russia had reconstituted its forces through mobilization and increased defense production, allowing it to seize the initiative in eastern Donbass. Russian forces captured Avdiivka in February 2024 after months of intense combat and continued grinding advances along the eastern front, albeit at enormous human cost. Military analysts estimated Russian casualties, killed and wounded, at between 200,000 to 350,000 by early 2024, with Ukrainian losses also substantial, though generally assessed to be significantly lower. Throughout the conflict, Western weapons systems have played critical roles at key junctures. The provision of HIMARS precision rocket artillery in summer 2022 allowed Ukraine to strike Russian command posts and ammunition depots far behind front lines, disrupting logistics. The October 2023 U.S. decision to permit Ukraine to use ATACMS ballistic missiles against targets in occupied Crimea changed the strategic equation in the Black Sea. Western tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and air defense systems steadily enhanced Ukraine's capabilities while raising political questions about limitations on their use. NATO, the United States, and the evolution of Western support. The relationship between Ukraine, NATO, and the United States has undergone remarkable transformation since 2014, accelerating dramatically after February 2022. Prior to Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, NATO-Ukraine cooperation existed but remained limited, with the alliance focused on encouraging defense reforms rather than providing substantial military assistance. The Obama administration, while rhetorically supporting Ukraine after the Euromaidan, limited lethal aid to non-lethal equipment like night vision devices, body armor, and radar systems, concerned about escalation with Russia. The Trump administration marked a shift in this approach, approving the sale of Javelin anti-tank missiles in 2018 and expanding military training programs. However, support remained cautious and became entangled in domestic U.S. politics during the 2019 impeachment inquiry, which centered on allegations that President Trump withheld security assistance to pressure Ukraine into investigating political rivals. The Biden administration initially continued measured support while attempting to stabilize U.S.-Russia relations, exemplified by the June 2021 Geneva summit with Putin. However, as intelligence about Russia's invasion plans emerged in late 2021, the administration shifted to intensive preparation for conflict, including pre-positioning military aid and developing intelligence sharing arrangements. When the invasion came, this groundwork enabled rapid expansion of military support. The evolution of Western military assistance has been marked by progressive dissolution of self-imposed restrictions. What began as defensive anti-tank weapons expanded to artillery, then to armored vehicles, then to tanks, and eventually to the authorization of long-range strikes within Russian territory near the border. Each escalation point triggered intense allied debates about risks of Russian escalation, with the United States generally maintaining some limitations, such as restrictions on using certain weapons for strikes deep inside Russia, while progressively expanding Ukraine's capabilities. NATO as an institution has carefully maintained its position of not being a direct party to the conflict, providing a coordination framework for member states, bilateral support rather than direct NATO assistance. The alliance established a comprehensive assistance package and training programs while individual member states provided equipment and financial support. This approach helped navigate the complex political reality that some NATO members, particularly Hungary, and to a lesser extent, Turkey, maintained more cautious positions regarding support for Ukraine. Despite these limitations, the war triggered the most significant revitalization of NATO since the Cold War. The alliance's 2022 Madrid summit adopted a new strategic concept, explicitly identifying Russia as the most significant and direct threat to Allies' security, a dramatic shift from the 2010 concept that had described Russia as a strategic partner. Defense spending across European members accelerated, approaching and in some cases exceeding the 2% of GDP target that had previously been widely missed. The accession of Finland and Sweden expanded the alliance's capabilities in strategic depth, particularly in the Baltic region. For Ukraine itself, the relationship with NATO transformed from aspiration to practical reality. While formal membership remained elusive, Ukraine's armed forces achieved unprecedented interoperability with NATO standards, and cooperation expanded to include intelligence sharing, real-time battlefield advice, and sophisticated training programs. The July 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius declared that Ukraine's future is in NATO, while establishing a NATO-Ukraine Council and removing the requirement for a membership action plan, streamlining Ukraine's eventual path to membership. Toward resolution, diplomatic efforts, and future scenarios. Early diplomatic efforts to end the conflict began almost immediately after the invasion. Turkey hosted talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in March-April 2022, producing a tentative framework that would have involved Ukrainian neutrality with security guarantees, deferred resolution of the Crimea question, and phased withdrawal of Russian forces. These negotiations collapsed by April 2022 amid evidence of Russian atrocities in towns like Bucha and hardening positions on both sides. Subsequent diplomatic initiatives have been sporadic and limited in scope. Agreements on grain exports through the Black Sea, brokered by Turkey and the UN in July 2022, though later abandoned by Russia, and prisoner exchanges represented the only significant diplomatic achievements. By late 2022, positions had further polarized, with Ukraine adopting legislation forbidding negotiations while Putin remained in power, while Russia formally annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, in September 2022, despite not fully controlling them. Competing visions for ending the conflict reflect fundamentally different conceptions of the war's nature. Russia maintains that it is fighting Western aggression using Ukraine as a proxy, demanding recognition of its territorial claims and Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine, supported by most Western allies, insists on complete restoration of territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders and security guarantees to prevent future Russian aggression. Various peace proposals have emerged from different sources. China released a 12-point peace plan in February 2023, calling for ceasefire and negotiations without addressing territorial questions. In June 2023, Ukraine presented a 10-point peace formula at the G20 summit that included complete Russian withdrawal, accountability for war crimes, and security guarantees. Brazil and other Global South nations have proposed frameworks emphasizing immediate ceasefires without preconditions. None of these proposals has gained sufficient traction to move toward implementation. The prospects for meaningful negotiations face multiple obstacles. Both sides maintain apparently irreconcilable positions on core issues, particularly territorial control. Neither side believes it has reached a mutually hurting stalemate that would make compromise preferable to continued fighting. Domestic political constraints in both Russia and Ukraine make concessions difficult, with Ukrainian public opinion overwhelmingly opposed to territorial concessions, while Putin has staked his domestic legitimacy on victory. Several potential scenarios could eventually move the conflict toward resolution. A decisive military breakthrough by either side could create conditions forcing the other to negotiate from a position of weakness, though most military analysts consider this unlikely given the current balance of forces. Alternatively, economic or political developments, such as Western aid restrictions, Russian domestic instability, or changing leadership in key countries, could alter the strategic calculus. A third possibility involves a lengthy frozen conflict along current lines, potentially lasting years before conditions for genuine resolution emerge. Any sustainable resolution will likely require addressing broader European security architecture questions beyond Ukraine alone. Russia's fundamental concerns about NATO expansion and Western military presence in Eastern Europe would need consideration, while also establishing credible security guarantees for Ukraine and other states bordering Russia. Economic reconstruction, which the World Bank estimates would require at least $486 billion for Ukraine alone, presents another massive challenge. For Ukrainian society, the war has accelerated nation-building processes and solidified a distinct Ukrainian identity separate from Russia. Over 80% of Ukrainians now support EU membership, and Ukrainian language usage has increased significantly, even in traditionally Russian-speaking regions. Regardless of the war's military outcome, these social transformations appear irreversible, that fundamentally altering the relationship between Ukrainian and Russian societies for generations. The international system itself faces profound challenges from this conflict. Russia's explicit rejection of the post-Cold War European security order has created the most serious challenge to rules-based international relations since World War II. The Global South's generally cautious response demonstrates the limitations of Western-led international institutions in addressing conflicts involving major powers. However, the war concludes, rebuilding a functional European security framework that accommodates both legitimate Russian security interests and the sovereignty of its neighbors represents perhaps the central diplomatic challenge of the coming decade. As Ukraine continues its fight for survival as an independent state, the resilience of its people and the sustainability of international support remain the decisive factors determining its future. The outcome will shape not only Ukraine's destiny, but the broader trajectory of European security, U.S.-Russia relations, and the viability of international norms prohibiting territorial conquest, a truly pivotal moment in post-Cold War international relations.